Welcome to part 12 of a vintage model traction engine restoration. This is a continuation of the previous video. I split it into two to make it easier to watch. In this clip you can see the square brass patch that I fitted, and this part of the job was successful. That's where I thought the tank was leaking from, but in reality it was leaking on the main seam. I purposely did a bad job in the last episode to show you how not to do it. So in this one I reheated the tank with the blowtorch and wiped away all the excess solder. And in this clip you can clearly see how the seams have come apart. On the left hand side of this clip you can see that I opened up the gap. I did this for the video. The leak was coming from this long gap, and the problem with gaps in water tanks and boilers is what happens in the gap itself. The first rule of soldering, even before you look at anything else, is the parts must be clean. If anything gets into this gap, like water, complete with lime scale, then you're not going to be able to resolder it. You can build up a fillet of solder on top of the gap, but that's not very strong. The best way to do it is to open up the gaps. I'm using a diamond cutter in my Proxxon motor tool, and I'm running this diamond cutter along the full length of the gap. I slightly closed the large hole by tapping it with a hammer, but I still went in with the diamond cutter to clean up the metal in between the two plates. Health and safety warning: because you're grinding lead, it's a good idea to wear a breathing mask. Once I'd finished grinding these gaps, the metal was clean, so I filled them using Friarlux solder paint, followed by tapping them back together using a small hammer, so the gaps were closed but still there, clean and full of Friarlux solder paint. I didn't video the soldering process because I really had to concentrate on what I was doing. I'll explain how I did it as I go along. Here's the water test. It's now full of water, it's sat on the bench, and I'm watching it and it's not leaking. In this clip I'm using a wire brush in my motor tool, and don't forget these are very dangerous. You must wear eye protection. The bristles fly off everywhere. If you look at the seam, this is the one where I'm working at the moment, you'll see that it's fully closed. For soft soldering parts it's best to have a lower heat, so I turned the gas pressure down, and once I'd heated the joints to make the Friarlux solder paint melt, I held the joints together with a pair of surgical forceps, and then using electrical solder, resin cord electrical solder that is, I ran a fillet all the way around the edge of the tank in the area that it was leaking. If you look carefully at this clip when my hand or the motor tool isn't in the way, you can clearly see the fillet of solder along the edge. The trouble with any soldering application is you have to be careful that it isn't the flux that is blocking the hole up. Often what looks like a successful repair fails as the water dissolves the flux after a while. And this is particularly true when you're silver soldering a boiler or any other pressure vessel. This isn't a pressure vessel, so soft solder's perfectly fine. Also, this tank fits right at the back of the engine in the bunker, so it's not very close to any heat source that would melt the solder. What I'm doing at the moment is using my Proxxon angle grinder, once again fitted with a flapper wheel, to generally clean up the tank. The seam at the front of the tank doesn't look very good, but it doesn't leak. It's certainly not worth heating the tank just to solder this bit and cause a lot more problems. I'm going to use some JB Weld just to tidy the part up. JB Weld is a cold process as it's a 2-pack epoxy resin. Now in the outer part of the workshop I'm spraying the tank with some etching primer. While I'm doing this I will talk about alternative methods of fixing old leaky tanks. Many years ago I was helping a friend build a trike, and the original fuel tank was a bit battered and quite leaky. I remember that he bought this special tin of tank sealant. To be honest, it looked and smelt very much like Hammerite paint. The idea was you poured it into the tank and rotated the tank through as many directions as possible to completely coat the inside of the tank. Then you poured the excess paint from the tank back into the tin and left it for a couple of days. And I remember that this stuff worked very well. The tank didn't leak after that. Once I'd painted the tank all over using etching primer, I took it back into the main workshop. When I built my new workshop, I had an air conditioning system fitted, and it's great, cool in summer and warm in winter because you can use it to heat the inside as well. and it's also pretty good for helping paint dry. And here is a clip of the paint drying with a bit of help from my air conditioning system. Time to do something else. Looking at the state of the metal in the lower part of the main bunker on the engine, I think this water tank has leaked for a long time. I assume that the traction engine was painted when it had a new boiler fitted. I thought I would give it an extra coat of paint. A thick extra coat of paint. Now that paint's drying, I went back to the water tank and the paint was already dry on it. So what I did was use some JB Weld, which is the same colour as the etch primer, just to improve the appearance of the tank. I then left it for 24 hours for the JB Weld to set. And during that time I repaired the firehole door and painted it. I re-silver soldered the hinge part using tenacity flux, and now I'm fairly sure that this won't break off again. I also used plenty of silver solder on the joint itself. 24 hours later and I'm in the outer part of the workshop again, spraying the tank with some HMG paint satin black, which is wonderful paint. I gave this about 3 coats in fairly quick succession. Like just about everything else on this traction engine, even this painting job took a much longer time than you would expect. The video is very heavily edited. Here's the water tank back in the main part of the workshop, underneath the air conditioning unit. And that's it. Once the paint's dried and hardened, I can refit it into the bunker. And this shot of the paint drying concludes the episode. Stay safe and well, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.